Professor Morrisey, welcome to Constitutional Chats. It is an honor to have you with us here today.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm glad I was invited. Thank you.
Well, we're talking about a republic today, and I've always said there's no one that explains the concept of a republic better than you. And so we are just really honored to have you. And we thought maybe you could start with just whatever you would like your opening comments to be on Article 4 of the Constitution. And we'll ask a few questions after that and just go from there.
Very good. Yeah, Article 4 is a key article in the Constitution because it addresses two of the really fundamental issues in politics, namely, what is a state, what kind of state America will be, and also what is a regime, what kind of regime is America going to be. And there's the distinction is this: a state is defined by the size of the territory that is controlled by one sovereign entity, and the size of it, and the level of centralization of the government. Size and centralization. So, for example, in the ancient world, you had many city-states or polises, right? Athens and Sparta and all of those. They were very small places. They were really no bigger than a county in many counties in America, but they were sovereign political communities. The polis, the city-state, was small but highly centralized. So, for example, if it had a democratic regime, you could have all of the citizens assembled in one place and passing laws that would affect the whole territory and all the citizens in it. The opposite thing in antiquity was the empire, and an empire was just the opposite. It was some of those ancient empires were huge, but they were very decentralized. Because there was no technology, there was no electricity, no telephones, none of the things that we have that can tie together technologically a state, so that if the emperor issued an edict, it could be months before it got to the borders of the empire. Later on, you got feudal states, which were in between France, England. They were in between in terms of size, but they were very decentralized. So a king, for example, if you read the Shakespeare plays, a king in England really didn't have undisputed sovereignty. He had to share it with the various aristocrats, with the church officials and others who had their own source of revenue and their own source of manpower. And then the modern state, which comes in and eventually crushes the feudal state, was the same size, France and England, for example, but it was highly centralized. Now you start getting, in the 17th and 18th century, you're starting to get better political organization, better technology, better communication, and you're able to really organize these larger entities. Now, the question with any state is the central government going to be overbearing? Is it going to crush the citizen involvement in the political community? And the answer that the American founders had was, of course, a federal state. It was a modern state. It was capable of defending itself against other modern states. And as such, it was viable, but it also allowed substantial citizen control of community, municipalities, counties, and the individual states within the federal union. So that's one issue. And the first three sections of Article 4 address specific issues that would arise in any federal state. The fourth article, which I'm going to elaborate on more in this introductory part, is the Republican Guarantee Clause, which says that every state within that federal union must have the same regime, and it must be a republic. That's a crucial thing, because as James Madison says in the 43rd Federalist, if you don't have the same regime in each state, then there's likely to become regime conflicts within the states themselves, and the federal union could easily break up. And so it has to be a Republican regime, and the other advantage to republicanism, and this is in the 10th Federalist, Madison in the 10th Federalist, is that it allows you to have a Republican form of government, which is a popular form of government, popular sovereignty, a popular form of government, but at the same time over an extended territory. So in other words, you can have something as big as an average state, modern state, but without the defects of a highly centralized state. You see what I'm saying? So you've got the balance between those two things, that it's big enough to defend itself, but it's also sufficiently self-governing on all levels so that it doesn't become a tyranny. That's a crucial thing. Now, the reason they're worrying that there's a guarantee clause in the Constitution about a Republican government is that one of the delegates to the convention, the Constitutional Convention, James Gorham of Pennsylvania, said that, look, at some point, some ambitious guy could arise in one of the states and set himself up as a military dictator, a monarch of some sort, and that would lead to tensions with the other states and a breakup of the Union. Why are they, just as a sidelight, why are they so interested in union? It's because they don't want North America to become like Europe. They don't want it to become like it was when the Native Americans were here, which is a lot of small communities fighting each other all the time. They want a unified national state with that's a free trade zone, no tariffs among the states or anything like that. And they want them to be at peace with one another. And so they want a commercial Republican regime. Now, in terms of what a regime actually is, a regime has four elements. One is who rules. In the case of America, it's the people are sovereign. And that's so in the states, the people will also be sovereign. Second thing is the institutional forms, the ruling offices by which the people rule. Crucial point, because Madison states in Federalist 10, which is really the centerpiece of the issue of whether this is a democracy or a republic, he says that in the ancient city-states, they were democracies. Everybody who was a citizen would gather in one place and vote things up or down. Well, that can get kind of rowdy. And a great deal of the debate will become too heated to make a good, prudent decision about different laws and actions. So what they did, so what he's saying Madison is saying, is that what you want is a democratic basis, popular sovereignty, but a Republican form of government. That is to say, the people elect representatives who then deliberate in a more systematic way, checks and balances, give a little time so that the representatives can actually think things through instead of just making on the spot snap decisions based on their passions. So you've got the rulers, you've got the ruling institutions. The other thing, of course, is just the purpose of it. Any regime is going to have a purpose. The United States regime, the purpose is defined very clearly in the Declaration of Independence. Once they say we have natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they then go on to say that governments are instituted to secure those rights. Just governments are instituted to secure those rights. And then finally, you have a way of life in any regime. If you recall in the Bible, God is always talking to the Israelites, I want you to follow my way, not the way of the Jebusites, not the way of the Philistines, not the way of any of those guys, my way, my pattern of life. Here are my commandments, follow them. And in the American Republic, of course, the way of life is largely a commercial. It's a commercial republic. The business of America is business. but it's also there was strong, of course, there's been strong Christian influences, especially in those days, more so than today, and other sort of civil social influences that were encouraged by the nature of the regime. So, for example, Christianity was encouraged by the First Amendment, freedom of religion. Freedom of speech encourages you to speak out. So that's what's on the table. If every major political debate has to do with either one or both of those two things, if you go farther enough down, you'll see that every major political debate in this country, then and now, has always been over what is the federal form of the state going to look like, and what is the nature of American republicanism.
That is a great opening and wonderful way to launch our discussion. And just the fact that your definition of regime alone, I think, is just a wonderful tool for everybody to have who's listening to the podcast today. And just
I should say, I had a student whose first job was out of Hillsdale College, was with the Wall Street Journal, and they sent her to Hong Kong. She was from Wyoming. I don't think she'd ever been out of the continental United States. And what I just gave you is Aristotle's definition of a regime. It's been good for 2,300 years, and it's still good. And so what she got over there and she just started analyzing what she saw around her in terms of that regime, the definition of a regime. And it sped up her ability to kind of get herself going and thinking about the Hong Kong, back in the days when Hong Kong was an independent entity.
So, and just to repeat and summarize your definition of a regime, and we can use this to analyze any form of government, would be who rules, the institutional formation, the purpose, and then the way of life.
Yeah. And it's very, and you can do that, by the way, not just with a country, but if you're in a business, if you join a business corporation, they certainly have a regime, don't they? A church will have a regime. A school will have a regime. You can identify who rules it, both formally and informally. You can do what's the purpose of the school? Different schools have very different purposes. So you can really, it's extraordinarily useful way of thinking.
Definitely a great way to walk into any new organization or country and analyze it. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Jewel, because I know he's got some great questions lined up. And Jewel, we're going to let you take it away.
Yes. So thank you for that overview. It was great. I have definitely have some questions that I would like you to first clarify on, because there was a lot there. So could you tell us first this concept of individual sovereignty that you had as one of the first steps? Could you explain that concept, and then also tell us how other regimes have seen it when the individual is not sovereign? Or I guess what I'm saying is tell us how that's actually unique. Individual sovereignty is a unique idea in human history, in the relation of the individual to the government.
Well, I actually said popular sovereignty, but at any rate, I'll be channeling Aristotle for the next minute or so. Aristotle says it gives 6 basic types of regimes. He's one of the great biologists who ever lived, so he loves classification systems, among other things, as all biologists do. And he classifies political communities in terms of regimes. So he has a numerical criterion. Is it ruled by one person? Is it ruled by a few people? Or is it ruled by many people? So that's one criterion. And then the other one is a moral principle. Is it good or is it bad? So, for example, a good regime of ruled by one would be a constitutional monarchy. Someone like maybe Queen Anne in England, one of a benevolent monarch. maybe Marcus Aurelius in Rome, someone of that sort. A bad regime of the one, of course, would be a tyranny, and we have all too many examples of that can come to mind. So that's one. Those are two regimes. Then there are two regimes of the few. There's one that he calls an aristocracy. He doesn't mean by that titled lords and ladies, people with periwigs and all that stuff. What he means is the rule of the few who are really good, who are really virtuous people, who have courage, or they're just, they're moderate in the way they conduct themselves. They have prudence, they're wise in practical things. And he says that those regimes are very rare, as you might imagine, right? In fact, Madison says the same thing about the rule of the one. You don't get too many wise and just monarchies either. So that's the good rule of the few. The bad regime of the few is an oligarchy. That's where people who are simply rich rule over the many who are poor. And one of the ways they tend to want to rule over the many who are poor is to squeeze every ounce of work and money out of them. Right? So that's an unjust rule of the few. The unjust rule of the many is what Aristotle calls a democracy. And by that he means the many rule, typically directly, right, without any representatives, but the many rule, and they're out to do exactly what the oligarchs like to do to them. They're out to squeeze the rich and take away their property and ruin them and dominate them. So you have these three bad regimes: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. The good rule of the many is what Aristotle calls a mixed regime. A mixed regime has one of the features that the American Constitution is famous for. A mixed regime would have in the legislature, it would have a bicameral legislature. So you'd have typically a Senate or one body that represents the oligarchs, another body that represents the many who are poor, the small d Democrats. And the rule is that no law can be passed, no policy can be enacted unless both sides agree. So that way you get a negotiation between the two sides. Rome had that. The Roman Republic was a good example of a mixed regime. We have an element of that, of course, with our Senate and our House of Representatives. So the senators do tend to be wealthier than the House of Rep people. And although it's not a formal requirement in our case, and of course, they're also supposed to represent the states. So that's basically what a regime is, and the different types of regime. And you could go around the world and classify regimes, right? In terms of their purposes. The Iranian regime is a rule of the few. It's the mullahs who rule. Their purpose is to advance Shia Islam around the world, and they demand their understanding of a Muslim way of life, right? That kind of thing.
So would we be able to see so sovereignty, if you're going to say it as simply as possible, is the vestment of ruling power? Exactly.
Who rules? That's even a simpler way of putting it. Who's in charge here? And you always want to know that, right? Whatever organization you walk into, you want to know who's running the show.
So in our case, when we're talking about Article 4, and we're talking about how the states are going to set up their state governments. Now, the republicanism that we have, it's required for the people to have that. Are they required to have a democratic republic? Are the states required to have the people directly vote?
Now, that's an excellent question because it leads up to the Civil War. Here's what Madison says in 1792. He wrote a series of essays they're called the National Gazette essays. And he wrote, and we also have his notes for when he was preparing the essays. What I'm about to read to you did not make the editorial cut, and you'll see why in just a second when I read it to you. Now you have this Republican Guarantee Clause, right? 1792, the Constitution is already in effect. Madison writes, in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. The power lies in a part instead of the whole, in the hands of property, not of numbers. All the ancient popular governments were for this reason aristocracies, because the majority of the population was slaves. The Southern, look at, this is the dynamite thing. The Southern states of America, including his own Virginia, I might add, which are on the same principle, aristocracies, by which he means oligarchies, right? He doesn't mean it in the Aristotelian sense. So civil rights, a lot of times when people think of the Civil War, well, first of all, isn't that a huge issue? Because you have this Republican Guarantee Clause, yet you have this potential difficulty because he understands a republic to mean a democratic republic, as you just put it, a democratic republic. However, here's the rub. The Southerners wouldn't define it that way. The term republic in Cicero, going back to the Roman writers and so forth, the term republic just means res publica, which means the public thing. It means it's what I'm talking about when I say a state, right? So they can say, okay, as long as we have some form of the rule of the many and not the rule of the one, like an empire, the way the Roman Empire was, we can have an aristocratic republic. In fact, modern Venice, modern in the 18th century was what I mean, modern Venice was called an aristocratic republic. It's not a democratic republic. Rome, if you remember ancient Rome, Roman Republic was a mixed regime, but the aristocrats, the patricians, did dominate. It wasn't a well-balanced regime. The plebeians had their say, but the few were usually pretty firmly in charge. That's how Caesarism starts, by the way, because what's the Caesarists, including Julius, the first one, he's figured out that if I can appeal to the people, the many who are poor, I can overthrow the aristocrats and I can take charge as the emperor, as the protector of the people. And that's something that many despots have done in subsequent centuries.
And how is that resolved constitutionally then, as far as that the southern states being able to claim, well, what if we have doesn't necessarily have to be a democratic republic? We know that it was resolved with a war, but how do we constitutionally understand it?
Well, that's it. I think the answer is that it was not consistent with there were two underlying, there was a regime conflict, in other words, built into the original Constitution. They were hoping, as you know, that most of the founders, as Lincoln proved in the Cooper Union Address in 1860, I think it was 1860 or around there, 1859, he proved that most of the founders were anti-slavery. They wanted to get rid of slavery in the long run. Well, that would have resolved the problem if they'd done that. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery from those Northwest territories. So that was the way they wanted to do it. That would have been the legal, constitutional, good way of doing it. Also recall George Washington. He was a slave owner, wasn't he? But what did he do in his last will and testament? He released all of his slaves, and except for a couple, I think that his widow was able to have his household servants. But if every slave owner in the South had followed his example, you would have had a gradual emancipation of the slave population, and again, you would have had genuine democratic republics in the South. As it was, the South actually hardened their position, as you know, in the decades following the founding, and it got worse and worse until the crises of the 1850s, the whole issue of slavery introduced into the territories. All of that led to civil war. And that's typically wars are different regimes fighting it out, right? The one in Ukraine versus Russia right now, right? Yeah, Russia, Putin is unhappy because Ukraine is a republic, and he doesn't want those Republican ideas to infiltrate into his regime in Russia. It's not unusual for regime conflicts to lead to war conflicts.
How unique could a republic in a state's republic institutional formation be? How different could it be from the federal one? I know that when we look at them, there are differences, but they're much more similar than they are different. What if a state decided we'll have a bicameral house, but our one house will be experts, and they will be in term for 12 years?
I think they could do that, because because the term republic is sufficiently broad. So it is, as long if you had experts. Here's the thing, though. If they were elected now, there'd have to be some sort of popular control and some sort of limit on how long they were there. But you could do that. Here's what's happened in America, of course, since progressivism took hold, especially since the New Deal. What you have is a kind of fourth branch of government, right? The administrative state, which is not elected, though. And so what you've got is now it's not really a democratic republic so much as a mixed regime now. And this is what is it causing? It's causing tremendous regime tensions, isn't it? Because there are many people who don't like being ruled by unelected bureaucrats. So you see how these conflicts are.
And that's exactly actually what I was almost getting to. And I'm very interested to hear each of your answers. You're giving me so much information on that. In all reality, the term republic is broad. But if we do look at, what do you think of the, I mean, there's a lot of terms for it. Sometimes it's easy for me to call it the administrative state, which is the kind of the unelected branch that seems to wield legislative and executive power, which is present in federal and state governments.
Don't forget judicial power. They've got administrative law courts too.
Yes, I do forget that.
That's Jefferson's definition of tyranny, is that have all three powers in one body of the government. Yeah.
So do you think that we could say, yeah, exactly. So do you think that you could look at that and make a claim against a violation of, make a claim there's a violation or that we're getting to a direct violation of the fourth article, that's not a Republican form of government?
Well, that you could do that with the states, right? Because it's the states that have, and the Constitution itself is supposed to guarantee a democratic Republican form to the country. But what you have, of course, is and you're all familiar with this idea, but when Woodrow Wilson starts talking about the Declaration and the Constitution, he reconfigures the whole rationale of the American regime. For one thing, he shifts away from natural rights, the laws of nature and of nature's God as the source of political legitimacy, political morality. He shifts away from that and shifts it toward what? Historical progress. Well, if you make that shift, that means wherever you go, that's historical progress. Where does he want to go with the Constitution? Well, as you know, he wants to go with a living, elastic Constitution. And the living and elastic Constitution can very readily accommodate this administrative state. That's exactly the move they made. And they were very clever in doing that.
Yeah, it's something that we get to talk about on this show, but rarely do we get to that point in talking to, your friends or political adversaries or whatever. You really get to talk about the philosophy behind a republic, or the way that it was meant to work, or why we wouldn't want to have an administrative state. So do you think that well, I'm not going to ask that question because the answer will probably be depressing to the audience because I've asked something like that before.
Is it a prediction question? Is it a
Yeah.
prediction? Okay.
Yes.
Here's my comment on predictions. I cured myself of making political predictions in 1968, long before you were born. And what happened was in 1964, Lyndon Johnson swamped the conservative Republican Barry Goldwater of Arizona in the presidential election. So I was thinking, okay, who are going to be the nominees of the two parties next time in 68? I said, well, obviously Lyndon Johnson is going to be. He just won a landslide election. He's very popular with Democrats and really fairly popular in the country in 64. So it's going to be Johnson. And since the Republicans lost with a conservative in 64, they'll probably go to the popular liberal Republican governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller. Now, that was a perfectly sane prediction if you made it in 1964 or 65, but it turns out it was completely wrong. It was Richard Nixon against Hubert Humphrey. Lyndon Johnson resigned more or less in disgrace. And Richard Nixon, who had just lost in 64, he just lost not only the election to Kennedy for the presidency, he'd lost to Pat Brown in California for the governorship. His career was dead in 1964, and yet he revived his career in the following 4 years, and there you had there are too many moving parts to make good predictions. And by the way, who's just discovered that recently? Vladimir Putin. Right? He expected to win that war in a few weeks. Didn't happen that way.
Yes, so never have our heads down or stop the work of education, I guess, is number one from that.
Yeah, do what's right, and then it'll shake out one way or the other.
Now, this question is, it's not directly on Article 4, but I think it is very important to the discussion, which is that there are different philosophies on the relationship of the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution and to the states. Now, I believe that it is implicit in the entire Constitution that the principles of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness actually mean something explicitly, and that they are implicitly like the bedrock of every article of the Constitution. So when we look at certain things in the Article 4 that the state should have the power to do, it would never include something that would violate those rights. In my understanding, what is yours?
I agree with that. As I mentioned it right at the top, the Declaration tells you what the principles are in the opening sentences, and then it says the purpose of government is to secure those rights. Now, the first take on that, of course, as you know, was the Articles of Confederation. The problem was that many of the Articles of Confederation just proved to be unwieldy. There was a lot of turmoil. Some of the states were a bit too democratic for their own good, and there was the kind of Athens-like factionalism that was going on in some of them. So they made the U.S. Constitution, but they never tried to violate the principles of the Declaration. They made compromises, as with slavery, right? And with that, the regimes in the South, but they made those compromises with a view towards those regimes becoming more and more like democratic republics. And protecting civil rights are intended, in other words, to protect natural rights. Simple as that.
And are you familiar that that's like if you bring up the Declaration sometimes in educational settings, there's a quick response saying, well, the Declaration of Independence is not actually law. That's something I've heard from.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's true. It's in the legal code, though. It's what's called an organic law, which means it's a kind of pre-law law. So it has a certain moral authority. It doesn't have legal authority. What gives it legal authority is the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence was a declaration by the Continental Congress. It set the policy of independence and it set down the terms and conditions of what that independence was. But the intent of both the Articles and the Constitution was to enact those basic principles, or to protect those basic principles via a form of government that would do the job. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I think that they're it's extremely important, and shouldn't be, that if it is brought up, if it's the purpose of the government to accomplish that it shouldn't be swatted away by saying, well, it's not a law.
Yeah, and if I may make a plug for my former boss, the president of Hillsdale College, Larry Arnn, he has an excellent short book called The Founder's Key, which does exactly what you're talking about. It links the Declaration to the US Constitution. It's called The Founder's Key. I don't normally
thanks for that plug. Yeah. Just being gracious. Or sometimes they're that good. You need to. Right. Kathy, I can keep going for sure, but please tell me if you want to get to any audience questions or anything like that before I do.
Well, thanks, Jewel. Yeah, we might jump into a couple of audience questions here. And Professor Morrisey, thank you so much for the recommendation of that book. That sounds like a book that maybe needs to be a Constituting America book club book here in the very near future.
Yeah, maybe you can invite him on to talk about it.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea. Before we get to the audience questions, we're going to be starting something new with our constitutional chats, because we have so many teachers with classes that are now watching our constitutional chats. And we noticed in our audience today that we have Terry Zulnock, who is watching with 3 students. And so Terry and students, welcome. And we also have Audie Waltman with the Texas Torah Institute, who is watching with 10 students. And we may very well be missing other teachers who have classrooms watching. And if you are and you want to type it in the Q&A, we'll try to give you a shout out before the end of the program. So I wanted to be sure and get that in. Now, we also have Victoria from Arizona has asked, in Article 4, the guarantee clause, it not only mentions guaranteeing a Republican form of government, but it also mentions that the United States shall protect each of the states against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive against domestic violence. Right. And could you talk a little bit about those other 2 clauses in Article 4? And if you think that the government is doing that now?
Well, as you say, it has to be at the request of either the governor or the legislature of the state. And in effect, in a way, calling out the National Guard does that a little bit, right? Because it's a National Guard. So it can be done. And we do it also with disasters now, disaster relief. So the worry there was this, and this is in Madison's number 43 again. They're all worried, aren't they, about what the slaves are going to do? Because the slaves, there'd been a bloody rebellion of slaves in Haiti, right around that time. So they're worried about what the slaves are going to do, and they're worried that at some point someone might do a slave rebellion and set himself up as the military mastermind of that, and alter the government, alter the regime of one of the states. So that's one of the things that they're worried about. But generally speaking, don't forget, under the Articles of Confederation, there was a fair amount of violence among the states. There were a few border wars among a couple of the states, I believe in New England. And so they have to, they want to keep, the main thing is that they want to keep the Union together. And they want the federal government to be able to intervene at the request of the states if the governor or the legislature has the sense that this is getting out of hand. We don't have the resources here to control this rebellion, and therefore we'd better call in the federal troops. request the federal troops. Now, today, have we ever had such a, we have riots, right? We've had riots and violent demonstrations of various kinds, but nothing that really threatened the overthrow of a state government. And I think those would be the kind of situations where the state would get so worried that it would actually say, please send some reinforcements, we need them.
Okay. Professor Klinger asks, how could a way of life in a state be guaranteed by the federal government? I cannot think of any examples in history in which this was explicitly attempted.
Oh yeah, well, of course, Sparta would be a great example of how that was explicitly attempted, right? Many of the ancient regimes, ancient Israel, same thing. The way of life was certainly attempted with the commandments and so forth, very detailed legal code, which stipulates how you should behave. Now in America, because we have such substantial amount of political and personal liberty, you don't really require it. But what you do, the way you do it here, is that you form institutions that that encourage certain kinds of behavior. They don't necessarily require them, but they encourage them. So for example, if you're an ambitious person and you want to be prominent, many people do, right? They want to be famous. They want to have, they think they deserve political authority. Well, okay. As long as they stay within the Constitution, what are they going to do? They're going to develop the habits of speaking to people, of talking to them, of listening to people, of running for election, of gathering votes. Those are all habits of the mind and heart, which are encouraged by the form of the government. See what I'm saying? And furthermore, in the regime, if it's a popularly based regime, if it's a democratic republic, clearly you're not going to strut around saying, I'm an aristocrat, vote for me, right? You're going to be a man of the people. So it habituates these folks. The best, I'll tell you the best book, and many people have read it, the best book on that is Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he talks consistently about the hearts and minds of Americans and why they are different. The hearts and minds are different than the hearts and minds of people in Europe of his day. I'll give you an example as he talks about women. And he says, you will not find in America women who are sort of simpering, kind of giggling type of women. They're serious. They have serious things to do. And this is way before women were professionals, right? This is when they're running a house, but running a house in America was a kind of business for them. And it was a challenge to do that. So it was, anyone who's studied the frontier, for example, knows that, but the whole America was a frontier in many ways. Abigail Adams, there's a serious-minded person, right? She's not frivolous. She's not one of these aristocratic ladies who's hiding behind a fan and flirting at people, right? This is the kind of way of life that a democratic republic is going to kind of channel you into, or it's going to encourage that kind of way of life, that kind of habits of heart and mind. So yes, it's not explicit in America, because if it were too explicit, it would destroy liberty. But it's been done many times in history, and in fact, almost every regime does have some sort of way of life that it either enforces, the way the Soviet Union did, the way communist China does today, the way Iran does today. They enforce a certain way of life, and you can do some things and you can't do others. The status of women in Iran is not the same as the status of women in France or England or America. And their way of life is fundamentally different. Yeah.
Well, and it seems that so often our culture enforces our way of life as well.
Well,
if not enforces, it informs it.
Yes, and of course, culture means what? It's encouraged by freedom of speech, which did not used to mean obscene speech, right? It did not mean there were rules about what free speech really was, and since the censorship laws have been basically obliterated, now you get license rather than liberty. But see how that happens. A law, you change a law, you change behavior.
Mm.
You know, and that's what these regimes are all about. A law about censorship or non-censorship is going to change the habits of heart and mind to some degree of the American people over time.
Well, thank you. And, going back to the concept of a republic, one of the things that we do at Constituting America is that we speak in schools. And one of the things that we teach in the schools is that our form of government is a republic, or as you say, a democratic republic. But so often when we ask the kids, we first ask them, are we a democracy or are we a republic? A majority of students will believe that we are just a democracy. And you hear, if you watch TV, you hear all sorts of talking heads constantly saying our democracy, our democracy. Why do you think it is that so few people these days actually know that we are a republic and understand that we're a republic? And why is it important that we continue to teach people that we are a republic?
Well, it's important because a pure democracy, what Madison calls a pure democracy in the 10th Federalist, he says they are tumultuous and short-lived, right? They don't last very long, and especially in small places like those ancient city-states. So the more democratic you are, or the more democratic you think you are, the more likely you are going to conduct politics in an off-the-cuff, impassioned way, rather than in a deliberative way that is encouraged in a representative form of government. Essentially, the distinction is we have a the sovereign people are democratic in the sense that there's no group of people who are like titled aristocrats in Europe. That is to say, a ruling class. If you're born into an aristocratic family, you're going to inherit the title of your father, and you're going to automatically you will be entitled to rule. No one is born entitled to rule except as equal citizens with everybody else. Now, of course, some people then go up the ladder and become elected representatives, and they gain political authority in those kinds of ways. But the distinction between republicanism and democracy, the fundamental distinction is reason going to be given a chance to rule? Right? Is deliberation, is compromise, is that going to be given a chance to rule? Or are we just going to have a democracy where the majority rules and can therefore tyrannize? The many can easily tyrannize over the few. Yeah. Well,
thank you. And in the short time that we have left, could you cover just briefly sections 1 and 2 of Article 4? Because I know when we first talked, and we had agreed that the most important part of Article 4 is the Article 4, Section 4. But are there any comments you'd want to make on sections 1 and 2 of Article 4?
Yeah, that's the privileges and immunities concept. And that was in the Articles of Confederation, by the way, that privileges and immunities. And what does it mean? Well, it means, first of all, if you go from one state to another, let's say you go from Kentucky to Ohio, you have to obey the laws of Ohio when you're there visiting. You're entitled to pursue trade and commerce. That's the commercial Republican part of the regime. This is federalism, by the way, right? The states are co-equal. So you're entitled to pursue trade and commerce there as long as you abide by the laws and regulations of that state that you're visiting. And you also have a right, of course, to go and come freely, ingress and egress. That's all in the Articles of Confederation. And so that's what that is. And it encourages a commercial republic, just the way the no tariffs among the states encourages commercial life in that way. Now, the other thing that is addressed, another thing that's addressed in those first 3 sections of Article 4 is the notion that, and I'm just quoting here, that a person charged with treason, felony, or crime who shall flee from justice in one state, right, and be found in another state, shall be delivered to the first state, the one where he committed the crime, or on demand of its governor, right? So in other words, the governor of the state, if you commit a crime in Kentucky and you flee to Ohio, the governor of Kentucky can say, okay, Ohio, cough him up. He's been accused of a crime here. He gets a fair trial here, but he can't, if the laws are different in Ohio, that doesn't mean that he's suddenly absolved of all guilt, right? And this was addressed by an 1860 case called Kentucky versus Dennison. William Dennison was the Ohio governor. A Kentucky citizen had helped a young woman who was a slave to escape Kentucky into Ohio. And Governor Dennison of Ohio argued that the article only covered acts that are crimes in the state of asylum, that is to say, in Ohio. Roger Taney rule knocked that down. That's a very tenuous argument, right? It obviously contradicts the section. But what Roger Taney, he of the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1860, said that this duty to extradite someone that the governor of a neighboring state has demanded is just a moral duty. And his argument was that, well, the Extradition Act of 1793, which is also known as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, it doesn't give any kind of enforcement powers on this. It doesn't say that the federal government can do anything about that. So in effect, it's a moral obligation. The 2 states are co-equal, so you can't do that. In other words, he was worried about states' rights. You know, Taney had the typical Southern position on states' rights. That ruling, by the way, wasn't reversed by the Supreme Court until 1987. It stood from 1860 to 1987, and the case there was Puerto Rico versus Branstad, where a guy from Ohio was in Puerto Rico. He hit some pedestrians in Puerto Rico, and then he fled back to Iowa, and the court ruled that he had to be remanded to Puerto Rico.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, we are right at time. And Aubrey, we had promised we wanted to show our audience one more time Professor Morrisey's website, and particularly we wanted to show his Article 4, Section 4 essay. We encourage you all, if you're still interested in this topic, which we hope everyone is, to go and read Professor Morrisey's essay. It's a great essay on Article 4, Section 4, and just check out all that he has. And Professor Morrisey, Eric Braverman asks, is there a way to sign up for your review on your website so people can actually get notices or emails when you've posted a new essay?
No, I'm very primitive technologically. All you have to do is Google it, though, and you'll never see a pop-up ad or a paywall on Will Morrisey Reviews. It's all for free, so you can download it anytime you want. Check out what's new there, and look at all the different things in that long table of contents.
Well, thank you. You're certainly a national treasure of our country, and we appreciate so much you sharing all your wisdom with us today. And I just wanted to see if, Jewel, do you have any closing comments?
Just thanks for a great show. We got to go for a while today, so I appreciate it. It's an important topic, I think.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, Aubrey?
Yeah, we're glad that you all could join us today. And thank you, Professor Morrisey. You always teach us so much.
Welcome.
Yeah, it was a great discussion and really enjoyed it. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh,
Thank you, Professor Morrisey.
Okay, thank you for inviting me over to your house. So to speak.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience, and come back next week for Article 5. We'll see y'all.
Okay,
Bye.
so long.